At my husband's funeral, my son said, "You'll get nothing, Mom. I'll take all the inheritance from you." He hired an expensive lawyer, but at the reading of the will, my lawyer read one sentence, and everyone started trembling. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. They say you never truly know a person until money enters the room. I used to believe that was just a cynical saying, the kind of thing bitter people repeat to justify their own disappointments. I was wrong. I learned that lesson the hard way, standing in black at my husband's graveside, with the smell of fresh earth in the air and my son's voice in my ear, saying words I never imagined I would hear from him. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I am 68 years old, and for 41 years I was married to the finest man I ever knew, Harold Callahan. We built our life together in Millbrook, a quiet town in upstate New York, where the maples turn red in October and the winters are long and honest. Harold was a civil engineer. I was a school librarian for 30 years. We were not wealthy people in the flashy sense of the word, but we were comfortable. We owned our home outright, a white colonial on Sycamore Lane with a porch. Harold built himself the summer after our youngest was born. We had savings. Harold had a modest pension and a life insurance policy. And over the years, quietly, patiently, Harold had invested well. Not spectacularly, just steadily. The way he did everything. We had 2 children. Our daughter Patricia lives in Portland with her husband and 3 kids. She calls every Sunday without fail. Our son Richard, well, Richard is a different story. Richard is 52 years old and has always been a man who believed the world owed him something. I am his mother, and I say that not with cruelty, but with the particular sadness of someone who watched it happen and could not stop it. He was charming as a boy, bright even, but somewhere along the way, perhaps when his first business failed, perhaps when his first marriage fell apart, he began to see other people's good fortune as a personal insult. He borrowed money from Harold twice and repaid neither loan. He missed Christmases. He called only when he needed something. Still, Harold loved him. Parents do. The warning signs, looking back, had been there for months before Harold passed. Harold was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the spring of the previous year. It was serious but manageable, the doctor said, if he rested and followed his medications. And for a while, things were stable. That was when Richard began showing up. He had not visited in nearly 2 years, and suddenly he was calling twice a week, driving up from the city on weekends, taking Harold out for lunch when Harold had the energy. At first I was relieved. I told myself that illness had finally shaken something loose in Richard, some buried tenderness. I told Patricia as much, and she was cautiously hopeful. But I began to notice things. Richard and Harold would go quiet when I entered a room. Once, I came downstairs in the middle of the night for a glass of water and found Harold at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of him. And when he saw me, he folded them quickly and said it was nothing, just old documents he was going through. Harold was never a secretive man. That moment sat in me like a splinter. 3 months before Harold died, I found a business card on his nightstand. It belonged to a man named Gerald Fitch, attorney at law, estate planning, and asset management. I asked Harold about it casually. He said Richard had recommended him, that he was just getting their affairs organized. I nodded and said nothing, but something moved in my chest. Something cold. Harold died on a Tuesday in November, quietly, in his sleep, the way he deserved to go. The grief was like a physical weight. It pressed on my lungs when I breathed. It sat at the table with me in the mornings. I had 41 years of waking up beside that man, and then I didn't. The funeral was held at St. Michael's, where we had attended services for 30 years. The church was full. Harold was a man people respected. Patricia flew in with her family. My friends came. Harold's old colleagues came. Richard arrived late. He sat in the front pew beside me, and during the reception at the house afterward, I watched him working the room. Not grieving, but calculating. He kept pulling out his phone. He stepped outside twice to make calls. It was after the last guest had left, when Patricia had taken the children upstairs, and I was standing alone in my own kitchen washing dishes because I needed something to do with my hands, that Richard came to stand in the doorway. He looked at me for a moment in a way I had never seen him look at me before. Not like a son looks at his mother, like a man looks at an obstacle. "We need to talk about the estate," he said. I turned to look at him. "Your father isn't cold yet, Richard." "I know when he died, Mom, and I know what's in that will." He paused and then he said it, the thing I will never unhear for as long as I live. "You're not going to get anything. I'll make sure of it. I'll take everything." I stood very still. The dish in my hands was one Harold had bought at a flea market in Vermont on our anniversary trip in 1987. A blue ceramic plate with a small chip on the rim. I set it down carefully. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. "Good night, Richard," I said. He left, and I stood alone in my kitchen, and I thought, so, this is what it is. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was crying. The crying came later, in small, private waves. But because my mind would not stop moving. I lay in the bed that Harold and I had shared for 37 years on my side of the mattress, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought, what did Richard know that I didn't? That was the question that kept circling back. He had said it with such certainty. "You won't get anything." Not a threat exactly. More like a statement of fact. The way you'd tell someone the weather. That confidence frightened me more than any anger would have. By 4 a.m, I had made a decision. I was not going to wait. I was not going to sit quietly in my grief and let events unfold around me. Harold had worked for 41 years. I had worked for 30. Whatever we had built together, we had built together. And I was not going to let it be taken from me while I stood in my kitchen, being polite. The next morning, after barely 2 hours of sleep, I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, is everything okay?" I told her what Richard had said at the funeral. There was a long silence on the line. Then Patricia said carefully, "Mom, do you know what's in the will?" I realized, sitting there at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, that I did not. Harold and I had spoken about our wishes over the years. The house would go to the survivor, the savings would be split between the children, that sort of thing. But I had never sat with an attorney and reviewed a formal document. Harold had always handled the paperwork. I had trusted him completely, and I trusted him still. But I no longer trusted the people who had been in his ear these last months. "I need to find out," I told Patricia. "Do you know who Harold's attorney was?" I thought of the business card. Gerald Fitch, the one Richard had recommended. "I think there may be a problem," I said. Patricia drove up from Portland the following day, leaving her husband with the children. She was calm and practical in the way she has always been, and her presence steadied me. We sat at the dining room table and went through Harold's files together. The old metal filing cabinet in the study that I had never had reason to open in 40 years of marriage. Most of it was ordinary. Tax returns, insurance documents, the deed to the house, investment account statements. But there was no will in that cabinet. Patricia and I looked at each other. "Maybe he kept it somewhere else," she said. "Maybe with the attorney." "Gerald Fitch," I said. "Richard's man." We called Fitch's office. His secretary was polite but firm. Mr. Fitch could not discuss the contents of any estate documents with parties who had not been designated as contacts on the file. We could attend the formal reading, which was scheduled for 2 weeks from Friday. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks, and Richard had a head start. That evening, after Patricia had gone to bed in the guest room, I sat alone at Harold's desk. I opened his laptop. I knew the password. It was our wedding anniversary. And I began to look through his emails. I felt like an intruder in my own marriage, and I hated that feeling. But necessity is a harder thing than sentiment. I found emails between Harold and Gerald Fitch going back 8 months. Most were routine, but one, dated 4 months before Harold's death, made my hands go still on the keyboard. It was a short message from Harold to Fitch, with the subject line amendment, final version. The body of the email said only, "Gerald, please proceed as we discussed." H, an amendment, a final version. Something had been changed. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. Here is what I knew. Richard had inserted himself into Harold's life during Harold's illness. Richard had introduced Harold to his own attorney. Something in Harold's will had been amended in the last months of his life, when Harold was on strong cardiac medications that affected his concentration and his sleep. And Richard, standing in my doorway the night of the funeral, had been absolutely certain that I would receive nothing. Was my husband manipulated by our own son? Had Harold been pressured into changing his will while he was weakened and medicated, and perhaps frightened by his own mortality? The thought made me physically ill, and yet it made a terrible kind of sense. I picked up the phone and called a number I had written on a notepad earlier that day, after Patricia had suggested it. The office of Margaret Howe, an estate litigation attorney with an office in Albany. Her assistant said she had an opening Thursday morning. "I'll be there," I said. I did not know then how this would end. I was 68 years old, recently widowed, and about to fight my own son for what my husband and I had spent our lives building. I was frightened. Of course I was frightened. But I was also, beneath the fear, something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. I was angry. And for the first time since Harold died, that anger felt like a rope to hold on to. Margaret Howe's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on State Street in Albany, with tall windows that looked out over the gray November street. She was a small woman in her late 50s, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had heard many difficult stories and let none of them rattle her. I sat across from her desk and told her everything: the business card, the emails, Richard's words at the funeral, the missing will, the amendment. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Callahan, what you're describing is a pattern that I've seen before. It has a name. It's called undue influence. And if it can be established, it is grounds to contest a will." She explained, undue influence occurs when a testator, the person making the will, is pressured or manipulated by someone in a position of trust or power, in a way that overrides their own free will. The elderly, the ill, and the medicated are particularly vulnerable. Courts look at several factors: the testator's mental state, the nature of the relationship, whether the beneficiary had unusual access, whether the change in the will was inconsistent with the testator's previously expressed wishes. "Harold always said the house was mine," I told her. "He said it in front of our daughter, in front of friends. He said it more times than I can count." "That's important," she said. "Witness testimony matters." She told me what we needed: Harold's medical records from the last year of his life, documenting his medications and cognitive state. A copy of the original will before any amendments. which would be on file with the probate court once the estate entered probate, a copy of the amended will, which Fitch would be required to submit, and any witnesses who could testify to Harold's stated intentions. We retained her services that morning. I wrote a check that made my hand tremble slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of what I was committing to. This was real now. There was no stepping back. On the drive back to Millbrook, my phone rang. It was Richard. "Mom." His voice was careful, the way it gets when he's working towards something. "I just wanted to check in on you, see how you're holding up." I was on the highway, both hands on the wheel, the bare trees moving past the windows in the gray afternoon light. He knows I went somewhere, I thought. Or he suspects. Or someone told him. "I'm fine, Richard," I said. "Thank you for calling." I was thinking, maybe we should get together before the reading, talk things through as a family. As a family. The phrase landed with a particular weight. "I don't think that's necessary," I said. "We'll hear everything at the reading." A pause. "Mom, I just want to make sure you have realistic expectations. Dad's affairs were complicated. I don't want you to be blindsided." "I appreciate that," I said, and I ended the call. He was warning me, or he was probing. Either way, something had shifted. He was no longer certain of the ground beneath his feet, and he knew it. The direct evidence came 10 days before the reading, in a way I had not anticipated. A woman named Carolyn Marsh called me on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been Harold's secretary at his engineering firm for 12 years before he retired, and they had stayed in occasional contact. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, apologetic. "Dorothy, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by calling," she said, "but I haven't been able to sleep since I heard about Harold." She told me this. 6 months before Harold died, he had called her out of the blue. He had seemed, she said, distressed. He asked her whether she still had the handwritten letter he had dictated to her several years earlier. A personal letter he had written for his files, describing his wishes for the estate in his own words. A letter that predated Gerald Fitch by years. Carolyn had kept it. She kept everything. "He seemed relieved when I told him," she said. "He said—" She paused, as if trying to get the words exactly right. "He said, 'I may need that one day, Carolyn. Don't let anyone have it except Dorothy or Margaret.' I thought Margaret meant his sister, but his sister passed years ago." Margaret. He had said Margaret. Had Harold, in the fog of his illness, managed to find one clear moment, one moment of unambiguous intention, and leave a trail pointing toward an attorney named Margaret? I asked Carolyn to send me the letter by certified mail and to make copies. I called Margaret Howe from Harold's study that same evening, my voice steady, though my heart was not. "This may be exactly what we need," she said. It was a letter in Harold's own hand, witnessed by Carolyn and a colleague, dated 6 years prior, stating in plain language that the Sycamore Lane property and the majority of their joint assets were to go to his wife Dorothy, with reasonable provision for both children, and that no amendment made under conditions of illness or external pressure should supersede this letter if it contradicted his wife's welfare. Harold had known. Somewhere in that kind, quiet man, he had known what his son was, and he had planned for it. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Friday at 2 p.m. at Gerald Fitch's office on Commerce Street, a polished, expensive suite on the 4th floor of a glass building that felt designed to make people feel small. I wore my gray wool coat and my good boots, and I carried a leather portfolio that Margaret had given me, and I arrived 10 minutes early. Patricia was with me. She had driven down again from Portland, and she sat beside me in the waiting room with her hand over mine, not speaking, which was exactly what I needed. Richard arrived with his attorney, a man named Baxter, broad-shouldered and smooth, the kind of lawyer whose suits cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Richard glanced at me when he came in, and then he glanced at Patricia, and I saw something move across his face. Surprise, maybe. He had expected me to come alone. Gerald Fitch conducted the reading himself. He was a thin man with careful enunciation and a way of looking at his documents rather than at the people in the room. He read the amended will in full. The amendment, as I had feared, was significant. The house, our house, the one Harold built the porch on, the one where our children had grown up, had been removed from my sole ownership and placed into a trust, of which Richard was named the primary trustee. My right to reside there was limited to 5 years, after which the property could be sold at the trustee's discretion. The investment accounts were split, but the split was weighted heavily in Richard's favor, with the justification that he had been Harold's primary caregiver during illness. A claim so false it made my jaw tighten. Richard was watching me across the room. He looked like a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the other person to understand it. When Fitch finished reading, there was a brief silence. Then Margaret Howe spoke. She introduced herself. She stated that she represented Dorothy Callahan in a formal contest of the amended will on the grounds of undue influence and questioned testamentary capacity. She submitted into the record Harold's medical documentation from the last 8 months of his life, records that showed he had been on a combination of medications known to affect cognitive judgment. She submitted Carolyn Marsh's signed statement. And she submitted the handwritten letter. The room changed. Fitch looked up from his papers for the first time. Baxter leaned forward. Richard's face went from satisfaction to something harder and colder. "This is outrageous," Richard said. He was looking at me now, not at the attorneys. "You did this. You had that letter manufactured." "Richard." Margaret's voice was very calm. "That letter was witnessed and notarized 6 years ago. The provenance is documented. I'd encourage you to lower your voice." The formal proceeding ended shortly after. The will contest had been officially filed. The matter would proceed to probate court. Nothing could be distributed until the case was resolved. In the parking garage afterward, Richard found us at my car. He had left Baxter upstairs, and it was just him, and his face was not composed anymore. He stood between me and the car door. "This is a mistake," he said. His voice was low. "You think you can drag this through court? You're 68 years old. You want to spend the next 2 years fighting? With whose money? You'll burn through everything just in legal fees and end up with nothing anyway." I looked at my son. At this man I had held as a baby, walked to school, sat with through fevers and heartbreaks. I looked at him for a long time. "Move away from the car, Richard," I said. He stared at me. Something in my voice, I don't know what it was, made him step back. Patricia and I drove home in silence for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm going to be," I said. And I meant it. The following week I did something I hadn't done in months. I took 3 days with absolutely no legal calls, no emails, no strategy. I drove out to the cabin on Lake George that Harold and I had rented every summer for 20 years. The owners, the Hendersons, let me stay off season for almost nothing. I walked along the shore in the cold. I made soup. I slept. I let myself cry for Harold in a way I hadn't had the space to do, because the grief had been crowded out by the fight. On the 3rd morning, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the lake, and I thought about Harold's letter. He had written it 6 years ago. He had foreseen this. He had loved me enough to think ahead and protect me. That thought was both a grief and a comfort, twisted together like the 2 sides of a single thread. I drove home rested, I was ready. The weeks that followed had a strange, suspended quality, the way a storm feels after the first lightning and before the thunder arrives. The court process moved slowly, as court processes do, and I learned to exist inside that slowness without being consumed by it. Richard called once about 10 days after the reading. His tone was different this time, softer, almost reasonable. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe we've both been reacting emotionally. Maybe there's a way to handle this that doesn't destroy the family." I was in the kitchen when he called. I was making tea, and I stood at the counter and listened to him carefully, the way you listen to weather reports before a long drive. He proposed a settlement. I would drop the will contest, and in exchange, he would agree not to exercise his trustee authority to sell the house for 10 years instead of 5. He framed it as generosity. He said the word fair 4 times in 3 minutes. I thought about that word. Fair. What was fair about a son who had attended his father's funeral looking for leverage? What was fair about an amendment signed when Harold was on medications that blurred his judgment? What was fair about a man using the word fair to describe an arrangement that still left me dependent on his goodwill in my own home? "I appreciate the call, Richard," I said. "My attorney will be in contact." He was silent for a moment. Then, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "Goodbye, Richard," I said, and I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. The tea had gone cold. Outside the window, the Sycamore Lane maple was bare and gray against a white sky. This house, Harold's porch. 37 years. No. Around this time, I began to understand how much I needed people around me. Not to fight my battles, but simply to remind me that I was not alone in the world and that my life had not collapsed into nothing but a lawsuit. Grief has a way of narrowing your world to a corridor, and I had been living in that corridor for too long. My friend Ruth, whom I had known since our children were in elementary school together, began coming over on Tuesday evenings. We would have dinner and talk, not always about the case, sometimes about nothing important, which was its own kind of medicine. Ruth had lost her own husband 4 years earlier and understood the specific exhaustion of widowhood in a way that required no explanation. My neighbor across the street, a retired teacher named George Albright, who had been Harold's chess partner for 15 years, started dropping off things: a bag of apples from his tree, a jar of soup, once a paperback mystery novel with a note that said, "Harold always said you liked these." Gee, I read it in 2 days. It was the first thing I had read for pleasure since Harold died. Patricia called every night, without exception. She was researching the case on her own, sending me articles about undue influence precedents, connecting me with a woman in her own network whose mother had won a similar case in Massachusetts 3 years prior. Patricia's steadiness was a kind of love I had perhaps not fully valued before, and I told her so on the phone one night, and she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Mom, I learned it from you." Through Margaret, I also connected with a grief counselor named Dr. Susan Park in Albany, who specialized in elder estate disputes, a combination that sounded almost comically niche until you realized how common this story actually was. She told me in our first session that what I was experiencing, the grief, the betrayal, the legal battle, was a recognized form of compound trauma, and that naming it helped. It did help a little. Richard, for his part, went quiet. I heard through Patricia, who had a friend who knew someone in Richard's social circle, that he had instructed Baxter to delay proceedings as long as possible, presumably hoping that the cost and the stress would grind me down. It was not a subtle strategy, but it was not an ineffective one. if your opponent was the person he imagined me to be. I was not that person. I filled the waiting time usefully. I organized Harold's financial records with a meticulousness that would have made him smile. I made a timeline. Every visit Richard had made in the last year of Harold's life, every call, every email, cross-referenced with Harold's medical appointments and prescription changes. It was a cold document. It was also, Margaret told me when I sent it to her, exactly the kind of thing that wins cases. "You won't get anything," Richard had said, "in my kitchen the night we buried his father." We would see about that. It was a Sunday afternoon in late January when they came to the house. I say they because Richard did not come alone. He brought his girlfriend, a woman named Sherry, who was pleasant in the overperforming way of people who are working at seeming pleasant. She brought flowers, yellow tulips, which I happened to know Harold had always disliked. And Richard stood on the porch with a look I recognized. The look he had worn as a teenager when he wanted something and had decided to try charm before tactics. I let them in because I was not raised to turn people away from a door and because I was curious about what approach they had decided on. We sat in the living room. Sherry made comments about how lovely the house was, how much character it had, how she could see why someone would want to hold on to it. A remark that was not accidental. Richard asked if I was eating properly, if I was sleeping, if I had friends checking in on me. He asked about my health with the attentiveness of a son who had not called me in 6 weeks, and I noticed that Sherry watched my face carefully every time I answered, as if cataloging my reactions. He was performing concern with considerable skill, and she was assisting. Then he moved to it. "Mom, I think we both know this legal fight is going to hurt everyone. It's going to cost you money you don't need to spend. It's going to drag Dad's name through court. And do you really want strangers, judges, lawyers, picking through his medical records and deciding what he did or didn't mean?" He leaned forward. "Dad wasn't manipulated, Mom. He made a decision. Maybe it wasn't the decision you wanted, but it was his decision, and fighting it is. It's almost like saying he didn't have the right to make it. It was skillfully done. I'll grant him that." He had taken my love for Harold and tried to make it into a lever against me. He was suggesting that contesting the will was somehow a betrayal of Harold's autonomy, that my fight was not justice but selfishness, dressed up in legal language. It was the most dangerous argument he had made yet, because it had a shape that resembled truth if you didn't look at it too carefully. I looked at Richard for a long time before I answered. I let the silence sit, because I had learned by then that silence unnerves people who are performing. "Your father wrote a letter 6 years ago," I said. "That describes exactly what he wanted. That letter predates Gerald Fitch by 5 years. Your father chose an attorney on his own, in good health, and documented his wishes when no one was pressuring him. What happened in the last 8 months of his life? When he was ill and medicated, and you were visiting every weekend. That is the part I am asking the court to examine." I paused. "I am not questioning your father's right to make decisions. I am questioning whether the decisions in the amendment were his." The room was quiet. Sherry looked at her tulips. Richard's jaw was tight. He tried once more. "Mom, if you do this, if you put us through this, you know our relationship will never recover. Is that what you want? To win in court and lose your son?" And there it was. The last card. He said it gently, almost sadly. "The way you deliver a verdict you claim to regret." Sherry looked down at her hands. The whole scene had the texture of something rehearsed. The hesitant sorrow, the measured pause, the implication that I was the one choosing destruction. I had thought about this moment. I had actually imagined something like it, lying awake at Lake George, and I had tried to find the version of myself that could hear those words and be unmoved. I was not unmoved, not entirely. There was a pull. He was still my son. You don't simply cauterize 40 years. But I thought of Harold's letter. I thought of Gerald Fitch's smooth office and Baxter's expensive suit and the word fair said 4 times in 3 minutes. I thought of standing in my own kitchen the night of the funeral and the look on Richard's face that was not grief. I already lost my son a long time ago, Richard, I said quietly. I just didn't understand that until now. He stood up. His face had dropped the performance entirely, and what was underneath was not pretty. The careful son, the reasonable man, the grieving child, all of it gone. What remained was someone I did not recognize, and perhaps had never truly known. You're going to regret this, he said. The words were low and deliberate, not heated, which made them worse, somehow, than shouting would have been. Sherry stood too, touching his arm, and this time he let her. They left. I heard the car on the gravel drive, the engine turning over, the sound fading down Sycamore Lane. I stood at the window and watched it go until I could no longer see it. Then I sat down in Harold's armchair, in the room that was still very much Harold's room. His books on the shelves, his reading lamp on the side table, the faint smell of the cedar chest in the corner, and I let myself feel afraid for exactly 5 minutes. Because the fear was real. Richard was younger. He had resources. He had a lawyer and a strategy, and the kind of cold patience that comes from believing you have already won. He had spent months constructing this situation, and I was one woman in her late 60s, recently widowed, fighting on unfamiliar ground. I felt all of that. I let it be real. And then the 5 minutes ended, and I thought, good, let him be certain. Certainty makes people careless. I called Margaret the next morning before 8 o'clock. Be ready, I told her. He's not going to stop. I know, she said. Neither are we. The hearing was on a Thursday in March, in a courtroom in the Albany County Surrogate's Court. A high-ceilinged room with wooden benches and tall windows that let in thin, colorless morning light. The room smelled of old paper and institutional heat, the particular climate of places where consequential things happen in ordinary surroundings. I wore my dark blue suit, the one I had bought for Harold's retirement dinner 12 years ago. I had my hair done the morning before, which sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. It was a decision about who I was walking into that room as. Not a widow, not a victim. Dorothy Callahan, who had been married to a good man, who knew what he wanted, and who was prepared to prove it. Margaret had prepared her case with exhaustive care. In the 3 months since the will reading, we had assembled the following: Harold's complete medical records, including the neurologist's note from 7 months before his death, observing early signs of vascular cognitive impairment, a finding that had never been shared with me, but that appeared in the records and in context was devastating. The note was careful and clinical, but its implications were not subtle. Harold's capacity for complex financial decision-making had been compromised during the precise window in which the amendment had been signed. We had Carolyn Marsh, who sat in the 3rd row behind me and who had agreed to testify. We had 4 of Harold's friends and colleagues who were prepared to speak to his stated wishes about the property. We had a forensic handwriting expert who had examined the amendment and noted subtle inconsistencies, suggesting it had been signed in multiple sessions rather than at once, possibly under time pressure. And we had Gerald Fitch, or rather, we had what Gerald Fitch had not been able to conceal. 3 weeks before the hearing, Margaret's investigator had discovered that Fitch had a prior disciplinary action from the New York State Bar Association, a finding that he had facilitated a will amendment under ethically questionable circumstances in 2019. It had not resulted in disbarment, but it was on record. And the financial connection was damning. Invoices showed that Richard had paid Fitch's retainer fees personally, months before Harold had ever met the man. Richard had not merely introduced his father to an attorney. He had already been paying for one. Baxter made his case first. It was polished. He argued that Harold had been of sound mind, that the amendment reflected Harold's considered belief that Richard had borne the greater burden of caregiving, and that Dorothy's claim was the action of a disappointed beneficiary trying to override a competent man's legal decisions. He was measured, credible, professional. I will not pretend otherwise. He earned his expensive suit. Then Margaret stood up. She was quiet and methodical in a way I had come to deeply trust. She did not perform. She did not raise her voice. She entered the medical records. She called Carolyn Marsh, who testified clearly and steadily about the letter, about Harold's phone call, about his exact words. She submitted the timeline I had compiled. Richard's visits cross-referenced with Harold's prescription records and the dates of his meetings with Fitch. She presented the forensic analysis of the amendment's signature. She submitted the invoice records showing Richard had paid Fitch before Harold was ever a client. And then she said to the court, "Your Honor, we are not arguing that Harold Callahan did not sign this document. We are arguing that the conditions under which it was signed, the isolation, the medical vulnerability, the presence of a financially motivated third party who had been installed as the sole legal advisor and whose fees were being paid by the primary beneficiary, constitute undue influence as defined under New York Estates, Powers, and Trusts law." She let that last detail land in the room without decoration. The judge made a note. Richard had been composed throughout. I had watched him from the corner of my eye. Contained, professional. His hands folded on the table in front of him, his face arranged into an expression of patient confidence. Baxter had clearly coached him well. He looked like a man who had done nothing wrong and was waiting calmly for that fact to be recognized. That composure lasted until Carolyn was on the stand. Baxter cross-examined her with practiced skepticism, trying to suggest the letter was ambiguous, that Harold had been a man who changed his mind frequently, that Carolyn's memory after 6 years could not be considered reliable. He implied that her loyalty to me had colored her recollection. Carolyn held firm on every point, in the unhurried way of someone who simply has the truth and knows it. She was 71 years old, a former administrative professional, with 40 years of experience, keeping other people's lives organized, and she did not rattle easily. She answered each challenge with the same quiet precision. She did not elaborate unnecessarily. She did not become emotional. She was, in short, a devastating witness. Then Baxter asked, "Mrs. Marsh, did Harold Callahan ever tell you why he was concerned about the amendment?" Carolyn looked at him steadily. "He did," she said. "And what did he say?" She did not look at me. She looked at Baxter, and she answered him directly, and her voice did not waver. "He said he was afraid of what his son might do to Dorothy after he was gone." The room was quiet in a way rooms rarely are. Not the ordinary quiet of a pause, but something denser. The quiet of people absorbing something they cannot unhear. Richard stood up. He actually stood up from his chair before Baxter could stop him, and his face was no longer composed. The careful architecture of it had simply fallen away all at once, the way a structure collapses not gradually but entirely, in a single moment. He was looking at me across the room, not at the judge, Not at the attorneys. Not at Carolyn. At me. As if this were still a private family matter that the room around him had somehow failed to grasp. "That's a lie. She's lying," he started. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom with the particular authority of someone who has spent decades waiting for precisely this kind of mistake. "Mr. Callahan, sit down, now." Richard sat. Baxter's hand was on his arm, and the expression on Baxter's face was the controlled dismay of an attorney watching a client dismantle his own case in real time. Richard's breathing was audible from where I sat. His hands, folded so carefully on the table minutes earlier, were pressed flat now, as if he needed the surface to hold himself still. I sat without moving. My hands were folded on the portfolio in my lap. I did not look away from the front of the room. I did not allow myself any visible reaction. Not satisfaction, not sorrow. Nothing that could be read. I had held everything steady for 4 months. I could hold it for 1 more hour. Margaret rested her case. The judge scheduled his ruling for 3 weeks out. But in the hallway afterward, when Baxter had steered Richard quickly toward the elevator, and the doors had closed on both of them, Margaret turned to me. She did not smile exactly. But there was something certain in her expression. The look of a person who has prepared for every variable and watched them resolve as predicted. "Dorothy," she said, "I think we're going to be fine." I nodded. I did not trust my voice quite yet. We walked out of the courthouse together into the pale March afternoon, and I stood for a moment on the steps and breathed the cold air, and thought about a Tuesday morning in November, a kitchen, a blue ceramic plate with a chip on the rim. Hold on, I had thought then. I had. The judge's written ruling arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks later, and Margaret called me before I had even opened the document. "It's a full ruling in your favor," she said. I sat down on the edge of the kitchen chair. The blue ceramic plate was on the drying rack, where I had washed it that morning. I had read about legal rulings in the abstract. I had read legal dramas, seen them on television, but I was not prepared for the specificity of it, the precise, unadorned language in which Judge Raymond Connolly of the Albany County Surrogates Court dismantled the amended will and everything it represented. He found that Harold Callahan, in the final 8 months of his life, had exhibited diminished capacity consistent with the documented neurological findings, and that the amendment had been executed during a period when his judgment was materially impaired. He found that the pattern of access and influence exercised by Richard Callahan, the introduction of a personally connected attorney, the isolation from independent legal counsel, the timing of visits relative to medical vulnerability, constituted undue influence under New York law. He found the amendment invalid in its entirety. The original provisions governed. The house on Sycamore Lane was mine. The investment accounts were divided per Harold's original instructions, a reasonable portion to each child, the majority of the household assets secured for the surviving spouse. Richard's designation as trustee was removed. Furthermore, Judge Connolly referred Gerald Fitch's conduct to the New York State Bar Association for formal investigation, the second such referral in Fitch's career. And this time, Margaret told me, it was unlikely to result only in a footnote. Richard's attorney filed a notice of appeal within the week. It was the last card he had, and he played it. But Margaret had anticipated it, had in fact built the case with appeal-proofing in mind, and the appeal was denied 4 months later in a brief, unambiguous opinion that declined to find any reversible error in Judge Connolly's reasoning. It was over. I did not hear from Richard directly after the ruling, not for weeks. Eventually, a letter came through Baxter's office, formal, legal in tone, acknowledging the court's decision and containing no apology. I read it once and filed it. I did not expect an apology. Some debts cannot be settled with words. Patricia came up the weekend after the ruling, We opened a bottle of wine that Harold had been saving for a special occasion. A good Bordeaux he had bought years ago, waiting for the right moment. We sat on the porch he had built, in the late March cold, wrapped in coats, and we drank it. And I told Patricia about the evening I had found the email, about the drive home from Albany, with my hands steady on the wheel, about the moment at Lake George when I had cried for Harold properly, finally, and let the grief be grief instead of fuel. He knew, I said. He knew about Richard, and he tried to protect us. I know, Mom, Patricia said. We sat there until the wine was gone and the stars came out above the maples. The house behind us was lit from inside, warm and quiet, the way it had been for 37 years. Mine, the spring that followed, was the first spring I had lived alone in 41 years, and I want to be honest about it. There were mornings when the aloneness was a physical weight, when I would come downstairs and the kitchen would be so quiet that I'd leave the radio on all day just to have a voice in the house. Grief does not resolve on a legal schedule. Harold was still everywhere, in the height of the kitchen cabinets, in the books on the shelves, in the particular way the afternoon light came through the dining room window. But I was also, for the first time in nearly a year, free. Free of the waiting. Free of the vigilance. Free of the slow, grinding dread of not knowing what was coming next. The house was mine, legally and unambiguously, and I could sit in Harold's armchair and simply be sad, rather than sad and afraid. That distinction matters more than I can say. I went back to work, part-time, at the Millbrook Public Library, the same building where I had worked for 30 years, among the same shelves I had organized, cataloged, and loved. The head librarian, a young woman named Danielle, who had been one of my favorite aides years ago, welcomed me back as a volunteer reading program coordinator. On Tuesday afternoons, I read to the children's group. On Friday mornings, I led a book discussion for the seniors. It was small and quiet and entirely good. Ruth and I began walking together in the mornings, 3 miles along the river path 3 times a week in all weather. She bought us matching rain jackets, bright yellow, which Harold would have teased me about, and we wore them without apology. George Albright taught me chess. It took me the better part of that summer to learn it properly, and I was a mediocre player and remain one. But Harold had loved it, and there was something right about learning it now, in the years after him. George and I played on Tuesday evenings, badly on my part, and with patient generosity on his. In the fall, I took a trip that Harold and I had always talked about, but never managed. 2 weeks in Portugal, with Patricia and her daughter Emma, who was 14 and curious about everything. We walked through Lisbon, ate long dinners, sat on terraces above the sea. Emma held my hand when we climbed steep hills. I thought about Harold every day and did not feel only sadness. I reorganized the house. Not to erase Harold, but to live in it as myself, in the full space of it, not just the side of the bed I had always occupied. I moved a reading chair to the window in the study. I grew tomatoes for the first time in the small garden bed Harold had always used for perennials. They were, truthfully, rather good tomatoes. Dr. Park, my counselor, and I continued meeting monthly. She told me, near the end of that first year, that what she observed in me was not just recovery, but, her word, integration. That I had absorbed the grief and the fight and the betrayal and made them part of my story without letting them become the whole of it. I thought that was probably right. As for Richard, I did not seek out information about him, but news finds its way back in a small world. Baxter, apparently, sent a bill after the appeal that Richard could not fully pay. The litigation had cost far more than he had anticipated, and when the inheritance was secured for me, The money he had expected to cover those costs was no longer available. His relationship with Sherry ended that summer. I heard this from a mutual acquaintance with no particular emotion. It was simply information, like weather. Gerald Fitch's second bar referral resulted, in the end, in a suspension of his license to practice for 18 months. I had not specifically sought this outcome. It was a consequence of Judge Connolly's referral, not my design. But I will not pretend I was sorry. Richard, from what reached me, had moved to a smaller apartment in the city and was working again. Some consulting arrangement, vague in the details. We had no contact. I did not initiate any, and neither did he. Whether that was the right outcome for a mother and a son, I could not say with certainty. I had offered him a version of me he did not want, a mother who would not simply yield, and he had made his choices. I had made mine. On the 1-year anniversary of Harold's death, I went to St. Michael's alone on a Tuesday morning, which was a quiet time in the church. I sat in the pew we had always used, third from the front on the left side, and I sat with him for a while. I thought about the letter, about Carolyn's voice in the courtroom, about the blue ceramic plate. Thank you, I thought. I held on. So that is the story of the Tuesday I buried my husband and the year that followed. What did I learn? I learned that grief makes you vulnerable, but it does not have to make you passive. I learned that the people who love you, really love you, the way Harold loved me, will find ways to protect you even after they're gone, if you're willing to look. And I learned that standing up for what is right is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply a matter of making an appointment with an attorney on a Thursday morning and refusing to be moved. Richard taught me something too, though not what he intended, that love given without conditions can still be taken without conscience. I wish it had been otherwise. But wishing doesn't alter facts, and I am too old to spend my days on wishes. If you had been in my place, standing in your own kitchen, holding a dish that belonged to the life you built, while someone told you that you'd be left with nothing, what would you have done? I hope you would have done what I did. I hope you would have made the call. If this story reached something in you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it. And if you have a story of your own, of holding on when holding on was hard, leave it in the comments. I read them. Everyone. Thank you for listening. My husband filed for divorce at my 73. I'm taking the house, the car, everything. My lawyer shouted, "Fight back." But I quietly signed the divorce papers. He celebrated his victory for a month, until he found out that all the property was registered in the name of... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I kept so calm, how I sat across from my husband of 47 years, watched him slide those papers across the kitchen table, our kitchen table, the one we'd picked out together at an estate sale in 1987, and simply looked at him without crying. The truth is, I had been practicing that calm for a long time, longer than I realized. My name is Dorothy Eleanor Marsh. I am 73 years old. I was born in Boise, Idaho, grew up in Sacramento, and spent the better part of my adult life in a 4-bedroom colonial on Wisteria Lane in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. I raised 2 children in that house. I painted every room in it at least twice. I planted the rose bushes along the front walk the spring after my mother died, because she always said roses were God's reminder that beauty requires thorns. For 47 years, I was married to Gerald Raymond Marsh. Jerry. A civil engineer who loved fly fishing, who burned everything he cooked on the grill, who cried at the end of Field of Dreams every single time, no matter how many times we watched it. I loved that man the way you love the furniture of your own life, not always noticing it, but unable to imagine the rooms without it. We weren't a perfect couple. Nobody is, after that many years. There were stretches of distance, seasons of silence, the ordinary erosions that come with decades of shared living. But we had built something real, something solid. At least, that is what I believed. The first sign came in the spring of my 72nd year. Small things. Jerry started keeping his phone face down on the table. He had never done that before. When I mentioned it once, lightly, he said the screen brightness bothered him. I accepted that. I was a woman of 72. I did not go looking for trouble. Then came the late evenings. He had always been a man of routine. Dinner at 6, news at 7, bed by 10. Suddenly, he was attending professional development meetings on Tuesday nights. At 69. Retired. I did not ask too many questions. I told myself he needed something, some sense of purpose outside the house. I was perhaps being generous, or perhaps I was being willfully blind. I have thought about that distinction many times since. By summer, the distance had become something you could almost touch. He sat across from me at dinner and looked through me rather than at me. When our daughter Linda called from Portland, he would take the phone into the garage to talk. Just hard to hear in the house, he said. The garage, where he'd never taken a call in 40 years of marriage. I remember standing at the kitchen sink in August, washing the dinner dishes, watching the backyard go golden in the evening light, and thinking, something is wrong. Not with me, not with the house, with us, with him. The thought arrived with a kind of terrible quietness, the way a doctor's voice goes soft before bad news. I did not confront him. I am not sure why. Pride, perhaps, or the fear that asking the question would make the answer real. What made it real was a Tuesday evening in October. I came home early from my book club. Marjorie had felt ill and we'd ended early, and found a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A silver Hyundai with a dent above the rear left wheel. I remember that dent. I remember thinking, whose car is this? I walked in through the back door. Jerry was at the kitchen counter, and he startled badly when he heard me. There was a coffee mug on the table that was not mine. Pink lipstick on the rim. He said a colleague had stopped by to drop off some documents. The colleague, apparently, had left in such a hurry that she'd forgotten her coffee. I said nothing. I washed the mug. I put it in the cabinet. But I noticed everything. 6 months later, on a Tuesday again, they were always Tuesdays with Jerry, he sat down across from me at that same kitchen table and placed a manila envelope in front of me. His hands were steady. He had rehearsed this moment, I could tell. Dorothy, he said, I want a divorce. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I've spoken with an attorney, he continued, his voice careful and practiced. The house, the accounts, the vehicles, it's all in both our names. I want to be fair, but I need you to understand. I intend to fight for my half. All of it. He slid the papers toward me. You should get a lawyer, he said almost gently. I picked up the envelope. I turned it over once in my hands, and then I set it back down and looked at my husband, this man I had loved for nearly 5 decades. And I felt something settle inside me. Not grief, not rage. Something cooler than either. All right, Jerry, I said. That was all, 2 words. He seemed almost disappointed I hadn't cried. I did not sleep that night. I lay in our bed. My bed, I supposed, or half of it, legally speaking, and stared at the ceiling and did what I always did when I needed to think clearly. I made a list in my head. What did I actually have? The house on Wisteria Lane had been purchased in 1989 for $112,000. In today's market, the last comparable sale on our street had gone for $480,000. It was in both our names. That meant, under Pennsylvania law, it would be divided as marital property. Half to me, half to him. $240,000 on paper. Enough for a small apartment somewhere if I was careful, if I was lucky. The joint savings account held approximately $68,000. We had an investment account, Jerry had always managed it, that I believed held somewhere between $90,000 and $110,000, though I could not be certain. I had not paid close attention to it in years. That was my mistake, and I knew it even as I lay there in the dark, cataloging the damage. There was his pension from the county. There was my small Social Security payment. There was the 2019 Subaru Outback in both our names, and the older Ford pickup he used for fishing trips, titled in his name alone. On the other side of the ledger, 47 years. 2 children. Every school play, every Thanksgiving, every ordinary Tuesday that had made up the texture of a life. None of that had a dollar figure, and none of it would matter in a courtroom. I was frightened. I will not pretend otherwise. I was a woman of 73 with a modest retirement income, no professional credentials beyond a bookkeeping certificate from 1972, and a husband who had apparently been planning this for some time. He had a lawyer. He had a plan. He had, I suspected, considerably more information about our financial situation than I did. But here is what else I had. Time. Jerry did not know that I knew things he didn't know I knew. And I had, over 73 years of living, learned one thing about powerful men who underestimate quiet women. They are almost always careless about the details. The morning after he told me, I called my daughter Linda. She answered on the second ring. She always did. Mom, it's early. Is everything okay? Your father is filing for divorce, I said. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted. I'm getting on a plane, she said. You don't need to do that yet, I told her. But I need you to find me the name of a good family attorney. Not someone your father would know. Someone in Philadelphia, maybe. Someone sharp. Linda was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had that particular steadiness she had inherited, I like to think, from me. Mom, what are you not telling me? Not on the phone, I said. Find me the lawyer first. I spent that morning doing something I had never done in 47 years of marriage. I went through every filing cabinet, every drawer, every folder in Jerry's home office. I was not looking for evidence of the affair. I already understood that was real. I was looking for the shape of our finances, the actual shape, not the version he'd presented to me over the years. What I found was interesting. There were 2 accounts I had not known about. Not hidden exactly. Both had statements with our home address, but filed in a separate accordion folder behind a box of old fishing licenses. One was a money market account in Jerry's name alone, opened 14 years ago, currently holding $41,000. The other was a brokerage account, also his alone, with a balance I had to read 3 times before I believed it. $217,000. I photographed everything with my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. And then I sat down in his office chair, the chair I'd bought him for his 60th birthday, the good leather one, and I thought carefully about what I knew and what I needed to do next. Jerry had presented me with papers demanding half of everything we owned, jointly. He expected a negotiation. He expected tears, perhaps, or anger, or a lawyer who would fight and settle for a number he'd already calculated. What he had not accounted for was the possibility that I knew about the separate accounts. What he had not accounted for was the question of when those accounts had been opened and where the money had come from. Because if that money was marital income hidden in his name alone, the legal calculus changed considerably. I picked up my phone and called the number Linda had texted me an hour earlier. "Hartley and Associates," said the receptionist. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with an attorney," I said. "My name is Dorothy Marsh. My husband has filed for divorce, and I believe he has been hiding assets." That afternoon, I drove myself to Philadelphia. 40 minutes on the interstate. The autumn trees along the Schuylkill were extraordinary. Red and gold, and a particular shade of orange that always made me think of my mother. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The plan, by then, was already beginning to take shape. The offices of Hartley and Associates were on the 14th floor of a glass building on Market Street, and the view from the conference room looked out over the Delaware River, gray and wide in the October light. I sat across from a woman named Claire Okafor, mid-40s, precise dark suit, the kind of stillness that comes from having heard many devastating things without flinching. And I laid out everything I had found. I placed my phone on the table and walked her through the photographs, the money market account, the brokerage statements, the dates the accounts had been opened. She studied each image without expression. She made notes in a yellow legal pad. She asked exactly 4 questions, each one surgical. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "do you understand what you've brought me?" "I have a general idea," I said. "Under Pennsylvania law, assets accumulated during the marriage, regardless of whose name they're titled in, are considered marital property subject to equitable distribution." She paused. "Your husband's attorney will argue these accounts were separate. That argument is going to be very difficult to sustain if the funds can be traced to joint marital income." "Can they be traced?" "That," she said, "is what forensic accountants are for." We spoke for an hour and 40 minutes. When I left, I had retained Claire Okafor at $350 an hour and authorized a formal discovery process that would compel Jerry's attorney to produce a full accounting of all assets held in his name, joint or otherwise. Claire had also filed a notice with the court that I was now represented, which meant Jerry could no longer contact me directly about the divorce proceedings. I drove home in the early evening. The sky was pink over the highway. I felt something I hadn't felt in months: agency. The following week, I noticed a change in Jerry. He had moved into the guest bedroom by then. That had been my suggestion, offered quietly and without drama, and he had accepted it with the slightly confused compliance of a man who had expected more of a fight. But now he was watchful. He began asking casually what I'd been doing, whether I'd spoken to anyone, whether I'd made any decisions yet. I told him I was taking my time. On a Wednesday evening, I was watering my roses in the front yard when a car slowed at the curb. Silver Hyundai, the dent above the rear left wheel. The window rolled down, and I found myself looking at a woman I had never formally met, but recognized immediately from the photo Linda had found on a faculty page at the community college: Sandra Briggs, 44 years old. An administrative coordinator in the continuing education department. Brown hair, wide eyes, a pleasant face currently arranged in a complicated expression I could not quite name. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she drove away. She had come to look at me, to measure me perhaps, to assess what she was dealing with. I understood the impulse. I might have done the same. What she saw, I imagined, was a small gray-haired woman in garden gloves watering roses. She did not see the meeting in Philadelphia. She did not see the forensic accountant Claire had already engaged. She saw a retired bookkeeper in her 70s who was quietly accepting the situation. Good. The direct proof came 10 days later. Claire called me on a Thursday morning, and her voice had an edge of controlled excitement that I recognized as professional satisfaction. The forensic accountant, a man named David Sternberg, who apparently testified in financial cases throughout the northeastern United States, had completed a preliminary review of the documentation I had provided and issued an initial finding. The brokerage account, Claire said, was funded by a series of systematic transfers from your joint checking account beginning in 2010. 14 years of transfers. Small amounts, irregular enough to avoid obvious detection. 100 here, 250 there. Over time, it accumulated. She paused. Dorothy, the total amount transferred from your joint account into that brokerage account is approximately $163,000. I sat down at the kitchen table. He moved marital money, I said. It was not a question. Over 14 years, yes. Mr. Sternberg can document every transfer. Claire's voice was precise and careful. This changes the character of the hidden assets substantially. We're not just talking about separate property claims. We're talking about dissipation of marital assets. That is a finding that affects the entire distribution calculation. What does that mean in plain terms? I asked, though I already understood. It means, she said, that the court can compensate you for that dissipation. It means Jerry's position becomes significantly weaker. And it means, she added, that his attorney is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with him very soon. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, 14 years. He had been doing this for 14 years. While I planted roses and raised our children and drove to book club on Tuesday evenings, he had been quietly moving money, preparing an exit, building a private life alongside our shared one. How does a woman feel discovering that? I will tell you, it is not exactly grief. Grief is for losses you didn't see coming. What I felt was something colder, a kind of final clarity. The last curtain pulled back, revealing not a monster, but something almost worse. A very ordinary man who had decided over many years to treat our life together as something he could simply walk away from when a better offer came along. I picked up my phone and texted Linda. First step is done. Don't worry. I know what I'm doing. The formal discovery process began the second week of November. Claire's office served Jerry's attorney, a man named Philip Court, whom I had met once at a bar association dinner years ago and remembered as someone who spoke too loudly and wore expensive watches, with a comprehensive document request. Bank records, brokerage statements, transfer histories, tax returns going back 15 years. I was at Linda's kitchen table in Portland when Claire called to tell me the request had been served. Linda had insisted I come for 2 weeks, and I had agreed, partly because I needed the distance, and partly because her house, her warm, cluttered house full of children's drawings on the refrigerator and the smell of good coffee, was exactly the right place to breathe. The morning after the service, Jerry called my cell phone 4 times. I did not answer. Claire had advised against direct communication, and I had developed by then a certain satisfaction in simply letting his calls go to voicemail. He left a message on the 4th attempt. Dorothy. A pause. His voice was different. The careful, rehearsed quality was gone, replaced by something tighter. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. Philip says you've hired someone in Philadelphia and that you're requesting records. We had an agreement. Another pause. Call me back. We had an agreement, as though a conversation over a kitchen table constituted a binding contract, as though I had somehow obligated myself to his version of this story. I played the voicemail for Linda. She sat with her coffee and listened without expression, which was, I thought, one of the most admirable qualities she had developed as an adult. He sounds scared, she said. He should be, I said. The escalation came the following weekend. I had returned to Dunmore by then, and on a Saturday afternoon, Jerry's car pulled into the driveway. He had not been staying at the house. He'd moved temporarily to a hotel, which was his choice, and the fact of his return without notice was, in itself, a kind of aggression. He walked into the kitchen without knocking. He still had his key, which was technically his legal right, and I had anticipated this moment. Sandra was not with him. That surprised me slightly. I had expected them to come together. Strength in numbers, or perhaps moral support. Instead, it was only Jerry. 69 years old, taller than me by 8 inches, and very angry in the particular way of men who have been told, for the first time, that they are not in control of a situation. You need to withdraw that discovery request, he said. No greeting, no pretense. I was standing at the counter making tea. I turned around and looked at him. Good afternoon, Jerry. Dorothy. His voice dropped, lowered toward something that was almost threatening. I'm telling you, this is not the direction you want to take this. You don't know what you're doing. Philip says if you pursue this, it's going to drag on for 2 years and everything gets frozen in the meantime. Your access to the accounts, everything. Is that what you want? To live on Social Security while lawyers fight over this? It was, I recognized, a fairly competent threat. He had rehearsed this too. I've discussed the timeline with my attorney, I said. Your attorney is billing you by the hour and telling you what you want to hear. He moved closer to the table. Dorothy, listen to me. I'm trying to be reasonable. We can settle this quietly. You take the house, I take the accounts, we're done. That's fair. That's more than fair. You take the accounts, I said, including the one you've been feeding money into for 14 years? The silence that followed was very complete. He stared at me. I watched the color leave his face and then come back differently. Not embarrassment, but something closer to fear. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. His voice was not convincing. I think you do, I said. And I think Philip does too, now that Mr. Sternberg's preliminary findings have been shared with opposing counsel. Jerry stood very still. Then he said, quietly and distinctly, You are making a serious mistake. We'll let the court decide that, I said. He left without another word. I heard his car back out of the driveway, and then the street was quiet again. I stood at the counter and let my heart beat slow. My hands, I noticed, were entirely steady. I poured my tea and carried it to the back porch, where the late November garden was brown and sleeping, and I sat with it until the cold drove me inside. The following week, I drove to the Pocono Mountains and rented a small cabin for 3 days. No phone calls about the case, no reviewing documents. I walked in the woods every morning, ate simple meals, slept 9 hours a night. I read a novel I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. On the second evening, sitting by the fire, I thought, I am going to be all right. Not in the vague, hopeful way people say such things. In the specific, architectural way of someone who has examined the structure of a situation and found it sound. I drove home on a Thursday. There were 11 missed calls from Jerry's number. I let them wait. Philip Court's office sent a settlement proposal the Friday after I returned from the Poconos. It was dressed up in formal language, but its essence was simple. Jerry was offering me the house and $30,000 in exchange for waiving all claims to the hidden accounts, the pension beyond a minimal share, and any dissipation damages. The proposal included language, and Claire pointed this out with the particular flatness she reserved for things she found insulting, that would have required me to sign a statement acknowledging that both parties had managed marital finances openly and transparently throughout the marriage. I sat at Claire's conference room table and read that clause twice. He wants me to lie, I said. He wants you to release him from liability for the asset transfers, Claire said, in exchange for the house and $30,000, which, given the full picture of marital assets, represents significantly less than your equitable share. What is my equitable share, realistically? She walked me through the numbers. The joint accounts, the hidden brokerage account, the money market, the pension, the home equity. Accounting for the dissipation finding, her estimate of my equitable share landed between $340,000 and $380,000, exclusive of the home itself. The offer on the table was worth approximately $240,000 plus $30,000, $270,000, against a realistic entitlement of well over $600,000, including the home. What do we do with this? I asked. We decline it, Claire said, and we let the discovery process continue. I nodded. Decline it. The following Tuesday, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I am glad I did. Mrs. Marsh? A woman's voice, pleasant and a little uncertain. My name is Patricia Velarde. I'm a friend of Marjorie's. From book club? She mentioned you might be going through a difficult time, and I hope this isn't intrusive. I went through something similar myself a few years ago, a late-life divorce. I just wanted to say, if you ever wanted to talk to someone who'd been through it. I was sitting in my kitchen. Outside, the November garden was gray and bare. For some reason, the unexpectedness of the call, or perhaps simply the accumulated weight of the months just past, I felt my eyes sting. Patricia, I said, I would very much like that. We met for coffee at a bakery in Scranton the following Thursday. Patricia Velarde was 68, recently remarried to a retired schoolteacher, and had a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room she was in. She had divorced her first husband at 64 after discovering he'd been conducting a second financial life entirely separate from their marriage. She had fought it, won more than she'd expected, and rebuilt from scratch. The hardest part, she told me over a second cup of coffee, isn't the money. It's the story you have to give up, the story you thought your life was. I understood exactly what she meant. I also called my son, Robert, that week. He lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we had spoken only briefly since the divorce announcement. He was careful with both his parents, trying not to take sides in a way that was admirable and also, at times, maddening. But this conversation was different. Mom, he said, after I had explained where things stood, what do you need from me? I need you to know the truth, I said. Not to do anything with it, just to know it. Your father hid $258,000 in accounts I didn't know about over 14 years. I am not the difficult party in this proceeding. I want you to know that. A long pause. Then, does Linda know all of this? Linda has known since the beginning. Another pause. Okay, he said quietly. Mom, I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. Yes, I said without unkindness. You should have. But I was glad he called then. There is no use dwelling on the timing of men who mean well. They came on a Sunday. I had made soup. A thick lentil soup that my mother used to make in the winter, the recipe unchanged since 1962. And I was sitting at the kitchen table with a library book when I heard a car in the driveway. I looked out the front window and felt something tighten in my chest. Jerry's car, and behind it, the silver Hyundai with the dent above the rear left wheel. They had come together this time. I did not go to the door immediately. I stood at the window for a moment and breathed, the way Claire had advised. You don't have to be reactive. You can choose your timing. And then I straightened my cardigan, put on my reading glasses, and opened the door before they reached the porch. I wanted them to know I had seen them coming. I wanted them to register from the very first second that I was not caught off guard. Jerry was holding a bottle of wine. I recognized it. A Pinot Noir from a vineyard in Oregon we had visited on our 35th anniversary. He had chosen it deliberately, I knew. Every detail of this visit had been chosen deliberately. The wine that carried memory, the Sunday afternoon timing when a person is softest, the fact that he had brought Sandra, who could play the role of the reasonable third party, the peacemaker, the woman with no history, and therefore no grievance. Sandra stood slightly behind him. She was wearing a pale blue sweater and carrying what appeared to be a small bakery box. She smiled at me. It was a careful, practiced smile. The smile of someone who has spent time in front of a mirror rehearsing sincerity. "Dorothy," Jerry said, "I hope we're not interrupting. We wanted to talk. Just talk." I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. I set the wine on the counter without opening it. I offered them seats at the kitchen table and sat across from them. I put my reading glasses in my pocket. I folded my hands and waited. I did not offer coffee. I did not open the bakery box. Small signals, perhaps, but signals nonetheless. This was not a social visit, and I saw no reason to perform as though it were. "We think there's been a misunderstanding," Sandra said. Her voice was warm and reasonable. She was better at this than Jerry, more practiced at the particular art of presenting a self-serving position as a generous concession. "Jerry has always intended to be fair to you, Dorothy. This, the legal process, it's gotten so adversarial. It doesn't have to be." "What would you like instead?" I asked. Jerry leaned forward. "Let's settle this privately. You don't need the courts involved. You don't need all these attorneys. It drags out, it's expensive, it's stressful for everyone. For the kids, for you." He paused. "Dorothy, you know I've always taken care of you. I just want to make sure you're taken care of now." He just wanted to make sure I was taken care of. After 47 years. After 14 years of siphoning money into private accounts. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of. The phrase sat in the air between us like something he had rehearsed in the car on the way over, and I wondered how many times he had said it to Sandra, practicing, and whether she had nodded and told him it sounded exactly right. "The accounts," I said. "The $217,000 in the brokerage account, the $41,000 in the money market, the $163,000 transferred from our joint accounts over 14 years. You want me to let all of that go?" Sandra's smile remained in place, but changed quality. Something beneath it hardened. "Those accounts were Jerry's personal savings," she said, "accumulated over his career. It's not—" "Accumulated from our joint checking account," I said. "Starting in 2010, I have the transfer records." A silence. Jerry's voice, when he spoke again, had dropped the warmth entirely. "Dorothy, you are a 73-year-old woman. This process, if you keep pushing it, is going to be extraordinarily stressful. I want you to think about your health, about what this kind of prolonged legal fight does to people your age." He had just threatened my health. He had dressed it up as concern, but the architecture of the sentence was unmistakably a threat. He was telling me that I was old, that I was fragile, that the machinery of what I had set in motion was too large and too grinding for a woman like me to withstand. He was betting that somewhere underneath the composed woman sitting across from him was a frightened widow in waiting who would rather have peace than justice. He was wrong. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said. "The offer on the table is generous," Sandra said, leaning forward now too, her voice dropping to something almost intimate, as though we were confidants rather than adversaries. "A free and clear house, $30,000. Gerald has been more than—" "Gerald," I said, transferred marital assets into private accounts without my knowledge over 14 years while filing joint tax returns that described our finances as shared. His attorney is aware of this. The forensic accountant's documentation has been submitted to the court. I paused. The offer on the table is not generous. It is an attempt to pay me to ignore what he did. Sandra opened her mouth. Jerry put a hand on her arm. They looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when a plan they were confident in has not worked. Something passed between them. Frustration. Recalibration. The silent negotiation of people who had discussed contingencies. But not this particular one. "This will not go the way you think," Jerry said. His voice was very quiet. It was the quietest he had been all afternoon, and somehow that made it feel more like a warning than anything else he had said. "Perhaps not," I said, "but it will go honestly." They left. I stood at the window and watched the two cars back out of my driveway and disappear down Wisteria Lane. The Pinot Noir still on my counter, the bakery box still unopened on my table. And I felt, yes, afraid. Not of the legal proceeding. Not of the outcome, which Claire and I had examined from every angle and found sound. What I felt was something older and more specific. The fear of being alone at 73, of the future stretching out unknown and unshared, of having to become, at this age, a different woman than the one I had spent a lifetime becoming. But the fear did not paralyze me. That was the thing I had not expected. It arrived, fully and without apology, and I felt it completely. And then it did something I can only describe as converting, transforming in my chest, from a weight into a kind of fuel. Every threat he had made, every condescending word, every careful, rehearsed manipulation, it all went into the same place and came out as something harder and cleaner than fear. I finished my soup. It was still warm. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in January at the Lackawanna County Courthouse in Scranton. I wore my good gray wool coat. I arrived 15 minutes early. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the particular municipal quiet of a place that processes human wreckage efficiently and without ceremony. Claire sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her yellow legal pad open, her posture arranged in the particular way I had come to recognize as her ready posture. Jerry and Philip Court arrived together 2 minutes before the scheduled start. Jerry wore a suit I'd purchased for him 12 years ago for his nephew's wedding. He looked, I noticed, tired. The weeks of discovery had not been comfortable for him. Sandra was not in the courtroom. That was interesting. I had expected her. The hearing was an asset distribution proceeding before Judge Maureen Cresswell, a woman of approximately 60 who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the air of someone who had been lied to in courtrooms for a very long time and found it more tedious than dramatic. Philip Corte opened with the argument I had been expecting. The brokerage and money market accounts were Jerry's separate property, accumulated from prior savings and a small inheritance from his father. They were titled in his name. They had been managed independently. His client had never intended to deceive anyone. He had simply, as many people do, maintained certain personal financial instruments separately from marital accounts. It was competently argued. It might have worked a year ago. Claire stood up. She presented David Sternberg's complete forensic accounting, submitted into evidence as Plaintiff's Exhibit A. The document was 47 pages. It traced, with the tedium of absolute precision, $163,000 across 14 years of transfers. Every transaction date, every source account, every receiving account. It was not a narrative. It was a ledger. It did not require interpretation. Judge Cresswell read for a long time, longer than anyone at Jerry's table seemed comfortable with. Then Claire introduced Plaintiff's Exhibit B, the joint tax returns filed by Gerald and Dorothy Marsh between 2010 and 2024, each of which declared household income and assets without disclosing the accumulation in the separate accounts, a pattern that, Claire noted without dramatic emphasis, raised questions not only for the divorce proceeding, but potentially for the IRS. Philip Court objected. The judge overruled him. Then Claire said very calmly, "Your Honor, I would also like to direct the court's attention to Plaintiff's Exhibit C." I had not known what Exhibit C was until that moment. Claire had told me only that Mr. Sternberg had found something additional in the final week of document production. Plaintiff's Exhibit C was a wire transfer record, dated 11 months before Jerry served me with divorce papers. A transfer of $22,000 from the brokerage account to a joint account held by Gerald Marsh and Sandra Briggs at a credit union in Wilkes Barre. A joint account. 11 months before he asked me for a divorce, while we were still married, while we were still filing joint tax returns. Jerry's posture changed when that document appeared on the screen. I watched it happen from 6 feet away. The careful stillness he had maintained all morning fractured in a way that was, I thought, almost biological. The physical surrender of a position that could no longer be defended. Philip Court leaned toward him and began speaking in a low, rapid voice. Jerry shook his head once, sharply. Philip sat back. Judge Cresswell looked at both tables. "Mr. Court," she said, "I'm going to need your client to explain the purpose of the transfer documented in Exhibit C." Philip stood. "Your Honor, if I could request a brief recess." "You may have 10 minutes," she said. During the recess, Claire and I stepped into the hallway. The courthouse corridor was empty and cold, the January light falling through tall windows in pale slabs. "That transfer," I said. "Sternberg found it in the final production," Claire said. "Court's team produced it. They had to, once the scope of the request was broad enough. I don't think they realized what they were handing us." He was already setting up a life with her. "A shared financial account, 11 months before he served you." Claire's voice was even. "That is not a person who decided to leave the marriage and then met someone. That is a person who built a new life and then informed you when he was ready." I stood with that for a moment in the cold hallway. When court resumed, Philip Court offered a statement on his client's behalf that used the words oversight, informal arrangement, and no intent to deceive in close proximity. Judge Cresswell listened with the expression of a woman performing the professional courtesy of patience. When he finished, she looked down at the exhibits for a long moment. Then she looked up. "I've seen enough," she said, "to proceed to a distribution determination. Mr. Court, I want to be candid with you. The evidence before me describes a pattern of financial conduct that this court takes seriously. I would strongly advise your client to revisit his settlement position before I issue a ruling." Jerry looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. I looked at the judge. "I've seen enough." 3 words, but they carried everything. The revised settlement offer came 6 days later. I was in my kitchen. That kitchen, that table, the same window looking out over the winter garden where the roses were bare and sleeping under a thin skin of January frost. Claire called at 2 in the afternoon. The kettle had just clicked off. I poured my tea and sat down before I answered, because I had learned, over these months, the value of being seated and settled before receiving important information. It is a small thing. It matters. Claire's voice had that quality I had come to recognize. Controlled satisfaction, very precisely contained, the professional equivalent of a smile kept off the face. "Philip Court reached out this morning," she said. "His client would like to settle." "Tell me." She read me the terms, the house on Wisteria Lane. To me, free and clear, no buyout required. Jerry was removing his name from the deed entirely. The house where I had painted every room at least twice, where I had raised 2 children, where I had planted the roses after my mother died, it was mine, completely and without condition. The joint accounts, a 60-40 split in my favor. The additional 10% beyond the standard equal division was a negotiated acknowledgement of the dissipation findings. Philip Court's way of conceding the forensic accounting without saying the words out loud. The hidden accounts, the brokerage account balance, now grown to $231,000 through market gains accumulated during the proceedings, divided 70-30 in my favor. The money market account, the same division. Jerry would retain 30%, enough to live on, modestly, if he was careful. Less than he had planned for, considerably less. The pension. I would receive 55% of the monthly benefit for life, beginning immediately. This was, Claire had told me weeks earlier, above the median in Pennsylvania divorce settlements of this duration. It reflected what the court would almost certainly have awarded, and Jerry's attorney knew it. The dissipation damages. An additional lump sum of $48,000, representing Philip Court's acknowledgement of what Judge Cresswell would have ordered had the case gone to a ruling. $48,000 was a number arrived at through calculation, not generosity. It was the cost of 14 years of transfers, computed and acknowledged and paid. Claire paused. There's one more condition, she said. On our side. Go on. Jerry's attorney has agreed to a full disclosure clause, meaning the settlement document will contain an itemized list of all assets, including the hidden accounts, and Jerry will sign it as a complete and accurate representation of marital finances. She spoke slowly and clearly, knowing this mattered to me beyond the numbers. No statement denying that the funds were marital in origin. No language requiring you to acknowledge transparency on his part. No rewriting of the record. He would not get to rewrite the story. That had been my one absolute condition, stated to Claire in our very first meeting, and maintained through every subsequent exchange, every offer, every attempted negotiation. I had been willing to be reasonable about numbers. I had been willing to move on timelines, but I had not been willing to sign a document that told a false version of what had happened, and he had known it. And in the end, facing Judge Cresswell's stated intention to proceed to ruling, the cost of that lie had become too high. What is the total value of the settlement? I asked. Claire walked me through it. The home equity at current market value, the account distributions, the pension capitalized over a reasonable life expectancy, the lump sum. She was precise and thorough, working through each line item without rushing, because she understood that I did not want a summary. I wanted to know every number, every component, the full and complete picture. The total came to just under $710,000 in assets and future income, plus the home. He had come to me in October with an envelope and a plan, expecting to walk away with most of what we had built together, leaving me the house and $30,000 and my silence. He was leaving with 30% of accounts he had spent 14 years building, a reduced pension share, and a signed document that told the truth about what he had done. The distance between those two outcomes was, I thought, a reasonably precise measure of what it cost to underestimate a quiet woman. Dorothy, Claire said, this is an excellent outcome, genuinely. I know, I said, and I did. I accepted the settlement that afternoon. I signed the papers on a Friday, 3 weeks after the hearing, in Claire's conference room on the 14th floor. The Delaware River was visible through the window, gray-green in the February cold, carrying ice in slow sheets toward the bay. I signed my name clearly and without hesitation on every page that required it. Claire witnessed. Her assistant notarized. It took 11 minutes. Jerry signed separately at Philip Corte's office the same morning. I do not know who was in the room with him. I do not know whether he was steady or shaken, matter of fact or devastated. I have thought about this occasionally and found that the not knowing bothers me less than I might have expected. Some chapters of a story are not yours to witness. They simply happen elsewhere while you are getting on with things. The month after the papers were signed, I heard through Patricia Velarde that Jerry had told someone at the Rotary Club, a mutual acquaintance, the kind of careless disclosure that comes from humiliation poorly managed, from the need to tell your version before someone else tells theirs. That Dorothy had brought in lawyers and made everything complicated. That she had gone looking for trouble. I found, when Patricia reported this, that I had no feeling about it whatsoever. Not anger, not vindication, not the satisfaction of being right. Simply nothing. That is, I have come to believe, the truest measure of a complete victory. Not triumph, not the pleasure of being proven correct, but the complete and genuine absence of the need for any of it. Sandra, I learned later, had not been pleased with the outcome of the joint account disclosure. The existence of the Wilkes-Barre Credit Union account, once documented in court proceedings and incorporated into the signed settlement agreement, was not something that could be made private again. It was part of the public record now. Sandra had apparently not known or not fully understood how thoroughly her shared financial arrangements with Jerry would be examined once discovery cast its net wide enough. The life she had imagined, built on the foundation of what Jerry had told her he had, turned out to rest on considerably less than advertised. Jerry and Sandra did not celebrate much that winter. They had very little, it turned out, to celebrate with. By March, the roses along the front walk were already showing new growth. Small green shoots at the base of the canes, the first reliable proof that winter does not last. I stood at the window and thought of my mother, who had said that roses were God's reminder that beauty requires thorns. I had tended those roses for 21 years on a street where I had now lived alone for 4 months. The street looked the same. The house looked the same. But I felt like a woman who had set down a very heavy thing she had been carrying for so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. I redecorated the living room. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. I painted over Jerry's greenish gray, a color I had never liked but declined to contest for 20 years, with a warm cream. The bedroom became a soft blue gray, the color of the Pocono sky on a clear October morning. I sold the leather office chair and bought myself a reading chair, the color of autumn leaves, positioned where the afternoon light came in. I sat in it and finished 3 novels before spring. Patricia Velarde and I began meeting for coffee every other Thursday. She introduced me to Margaret, a retired county judge, and Vivian, a librarian who made her own wine and had opinions about everything. The 4 of us talked about books and local politics and the particular indignities and satisfactions of being women of a certain age. And I found, to my considerable surprise, that I was happy. Not provisionally. Genuinely happy in the way possible, only when you are living a life you have actually chosen. Linda came in April. At the end of a long day clearing out the garage, we sat on the back porch with wine, and she said, "Mom, you look good." Not in the searching, reassuring way, but in the simple way of someone reporting what they see. "I feel good," I said, and meant it exactly. Robert came in May with his wife, fixed the back fence Jerry had been meaning to repair for 3 years, and we ate dinner together on the porch. Something between us that had been strained eased slightly. That felt like enough. As for Jerry and Sandra, The joint account disclosure had surfaced information Sandra apparently hadn't fully known, that the financial future Jerry had promised her was now substantially redistributed to me. By summer, the silver Hyundai was no longer parked outside his rental. A mutual acquaintance saw him at the pharmacy in August and said he looked smaller than she remembered. I did not feel sorry for him. I found grief for the marriage, yes. A settled, historical sadness I thought would always live somewhere in the house of who I had become. But underneath it was something cleaner. Autumn came again. I planted climbing roses along the fence Robert had mended. Deep red, trained upward. They would not bloom until next year. I planted them anyway. That, I thought, is what 73 looks like when it is going well. People say that at 73, it is too late to start over. I disagree. Starting over at 73 means you have 73 years of evidence about who you are and what you can survive. It means you know the difference between patience and surrender. It means that when someone slides papers across a kitchen table and tells you that you have already lost, you recognize it as an opening bid, not a final verdict. Know what you own, your history, your labor, your decades of showing up. Know it precisely, because no one else will know it for you. What would you have done? Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening.